Good morning, honorable ambassadors, members of the African Diplomatic Corps, U.S. government officials, members of the business community, and distinguished guests all. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. Those of you joining us here today in person and those participating online. I'm Dana Banks, and I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. And I'd first like to start off by acknowledging Ambassador Ramayad and Sarah Way and the entire Africa Center team for their support in organizing this wonderful event. This morning's conversation sits at the heart of the Atlantic Council Africa Center's mission, advancing dynamic partnerships that unlock Africa's economic potential while strengthening prosperity and security on both sides of the Atlantic. And I'm excited to be chairing our new trade and investment initiative, creating a platform where policy meets practice, where research informs real investment decisions, and where government and private sector leaders can have the candid, strategic conversations that move initiatives forward. 2025 proved to be a pivotal year across the African continent, with national elections in Cameroon, Tanzania, Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, the Central African Republic, and Guinea-Bissau, reshaping political landscapes and, by extension, the business environment in these key markets. As we look ahead to 2026, additional electoral contests promise to further influence governance structures, economic policy directions, and market dynamics across the region. For businesses and for investors, these electoral cycles present both challenge and opportunity. The challenge of navigating regulatory uncertainty and political transitions, and the opportunity to align strategies with economic reform agendas and shifting market conditions. So this morning, we've assembled an exceptional panel representing diverse perspectives from the private sector and business advocacy to development economics to help us understand how electoral dynamics translate into tangible implications for investment decisions, risk management, and long-term strategic positioning in Africa's evolving markets. So with that, we have limited time, so let's dive right in. I'll start by introducing members of our esteemed panel. First to my left is Brian Lanza. He's a partner in Mercury Public Affairs' Washington, D.C. office, specializing in public affairs and media strategy. He's a leading Republican strategist with extensive experience in political campaigns, policy and media relations, and key leadership for clients across Mercury's U.S. and international offices. Brian, welcome.
Thank you.
Next to Brian, I have Flory Lizaire, who is the third president and CEO of Corporate Council of Africa. Ms. Lizaire brings expertise and extensive network on trade in Africa to her role, along with a strong track record of working with the private sector to translate policy into action. Ms. Lizaire joined CCA from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where she previously served in a storied tenure as Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Africa. Next to Flory is Ambassador Troy Frittrell, former U.S. Ambassador to Guinea and a career member of the Senior Foreign Service, retired. He also served as the former Senior Bureau Official for the Department of State's Bureau of African Affairs. Welcome, Ambassador Frittrell. Next, we have Kendra Gaither, who is the Senior Vice President of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and President of the Chamber's U.S. Africa Business Center. She joined the U.S. Chamber in 2015, bringing a wealth of solutions-oriented global public policy expertise to her role. Welcome, Kendra. And last but certainly not least is Mr. Andrew Dabelin. He is the World Bank's Africa Region Chief Economist since July 2022. And as Chief Economist, he is responsible for providing guidance on strategic priorities and technical quality of economic analysis in the region, as well as for developing major regional economic studies. Welcome, Mr. Dublin.
Thank you.
All right, first question. I think I will throw it out to you, Mr. Dublin. Actually, this is a question for the entire panel. So we'll start here with Brian. Looking at the 2025 election cycle and the transitions we've observed across the continent, what has surprised you most about how markets and investors have responded to electoral outcomes across these countries? And as we anticipate the elections coming up this year, what should be top of mind for businesses operating in or considering entry into markets across the continent?
Well, thank you for that question. I think it has a lot to do, with the shift that's taking place here in the U.S., right? You're seeing a tremendous amount of interest from government officials in Africa. You're seeing a lot of investment interests taking place that wasn't there before. You're seeing it for the first time being prioritized. And so as governments are transitioning to their elections, and there's going to be elections this year and there were elections last year, is you saw more of an engagement, at least what I noticed at this level. You saw now political parties, engaging folks in the administration, trying to establish relationships early, because they know this administration is not afraid to lean in and pick winners and losers in some of these things. You see governments doing the same thing, looking at the election around the corner, seeing who can they develop relationships with in this administration in hopes that could have some positive impact as they go to the polls and seek elections. But I think the biggest thing that I've noticed and that's encouraging is the level of engagement that's now taking place at a layered event, right? You have investment community involved, you have investors more confused, you have government, and you have them pushing in the right direction, is how to elevate Africa, how to create the infrastructure, and how to work with these individual governments to make sure that the U.S. alliance with Africa is strengthened over time and in the short term, but in a direct result to counter all things China. So there's a strategic purpose, at least from the U.S.'s standpoint, to some of these elections and to the outcomes and to how they engage with these new governments, understanding that is now a competitive field, in the global geopolitical space.
Thank you, Brian. I fully align with those comments. Flory, what are you seeing and what would you advise for the coming year in light of the new political context across the continent?
I think that when you count the number of African countries that have had elections, 2024, 19, 2025, 10, 2026, we're expecting another 10, 2027, add Nigeria. If you add all of that together, you've got about 40 countries out of the entire continent that have had elections or will be having elections. And I think that leads to the main point I want to make, is that most of the businesses we see understand that they're in Africa for the long term. It's a long game for them. They're not going to just jump in and jump out. They're going to want to do things that will secure their positions, make sure that their contracts are respected when they go from one regime to another regime. They're working with local and global associations like CCA, the Chamber, and others to try to get in and make the policy points to the new regimes. But I think that for the most part, we see that they are staying. We have examples of companies that have stayed in countries through difficult times, conflict even. We see in Guinea a US company that actually went in 2019, stayed there through the military regime and invested $1.8 billion in an iron ore project, high-grade iron ore project. So, or you look at Tanzania, where unfortunately there was post-election conflict and violence. But for the most part, companies in infrastructure, energy, mining have stayed in Tanzania. So I think the main point is that African countries are going to continue to go through election cycles. They're going to continue to take account of what's happening with major partners like the US. and they're going to try to do things to secure their investments, safeguard their personnel and physical equipment in countries, but they're not just going to run. And I think that's the good thing. I think for companies going in, I'll just end here, for companies going in, it's a little different because they are not yet fully invested in those countries. And so I think they're going to look around the region. If they're going to West Africa or East Africa, they're going to look around the region. They're going to see where's really the most secure place to go. They're going to diversify their investments and spread the risk and mitigate that risk. They're not like the companies that are already there going to just stick it out. So I think that two slightly different approaches for those already on the continent and investing and those looking to invest.
Excellent point, Flory. You talk about resilience and risk management and how to balance those both. And you name-checked Guinea, and we just so happen to have the former ambassador to Guinea sitting next to you. So over to you, Ambassador Futrell.
Thanks. Well, right off the bat, I would say on that list of countries that had elections, I would add the Republic of Guinea. They slipped it in under the wire, December, 28th? But it was the 2025 election, so kudos to them. I would also say, following on Flory's comments, you asked what may have surprised regarding investors and how they responded to the political environments across the continent. And I would say it was the depth of pragmatism that I saw there. You could look at the ways, for example, in Cote d'Ivoire, is it a second election or is it a fourth election on how this is going? But that sort of box checking, maybe as we would call report card diplomacy of the past, the companies weren't doing that. They were looking at where is an environment conducive to work, and they were being less strident and less guided by symbolism. And so you saw some really interesting efforts. In Cote d'Ivoire, I would think the pragmatism was on the side of the private sector, believing that the stability that they saw there was likely to continue, and the policies that were there were likely to continue, and they were willing to continue investing all the way through the process. In a place like Angola, you saw really interesting pragmatism on behalf of the government. What can we do to demonstrate that this investment that has been coming actually has this direct contact and direct effect on the people of Angola? And then an interesting combination of the two, in Gabon, we saw both some incredible pragmatism on the sides of both the government and the private sector. And so when they engaged there, you saw a really interesting change in how the environment and investment cycles were going. And the way I would look there is, you look at countries like Guinea and Gabon, it was an easy and I think intellectually artificial way of grouping them together with other countries that had had coups. They're very different from the ones in the Sahel. But just like not all coup countries are the same, not all democracies are the same. You know, Bob Mugabe used to win elections. And so, but let's not ever pretend that that was a democracy. And so that idea of pragmatism, I think, is really sunk into the business community, and you're seeing a much more energetic expectation of how to engage than we used to see in the past.
Thank you for that. That's really, I think, helpful insight as we turn to you, Kendra, and from the Chamber's perspective, that pragmatism, and how are you seeing that amongst companies operating on the continent and those who are looking to enter onto the continent and into those markets in this, again, this post-electoral context?
Thank you, Dana. Thank you for the invitation. Congrats on your new role, and delighted to join this esteemed panel. I'm going to align myself with some of the things that have been said before, but I might categorize it as business goes beyond the headlines. I think it's very easy to see headlines around elections or focus around, what the implications may be. But to Ambassador Futrell's point and to Flory's point, companies are beyond the headlines, looking at fundamentals. They are making long-range decisions, and so elections are indeed cycles, and they can be indications of longer-term stability of a market. But companies who are particularly already invested are really thinking about how they continue to advance their long-term vision, to partner with countries who are going to maintain that stability. There's going to be predictability in the regulatory environment and mix where they're operating. And so I think they're less swayed, if you will, and bring a pragmatism, as to use the ambassador's word, to really take long-range decisions that are based on the principles that all companies invest in, which is, are these investments economically viable over time? Is there a reasonable expectation of a return on investment in this environment? In this space, if there are disputes, be it with the government or some other entity, is there reasonable expectation of due process? Do the rules, laws, frameworks work? And that is something, that should transcend beyond government transitions. I do think the calculus is a little bit different for those companies that are considering new entrants. That's a different calculus, but again, encourage them to go beyond headlines. And I think by and large, the companies that we're privileged to work with are going beyond sort of that surface level examination of what they're seeing in the paper. The perception risks, I think we all know quite well, that there is more of a risk of perception than there is often reality. And so going beyond the headlines can help address that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kendra. And speaking of going beyond the headlines to the actual numbers, to the economic data and analysis, Andrew, how do you weigh in terms of sort of the hard facts that you're seeing in the economic data across some of these countries that have had elections and who will have elections this year, and what kind of sort of confidence can that give to investors?
Yeah, thank you. So I think what we find out is, what is surprising is that there's been no surprises at all. Because usually elections are associated with all kinds of volatility. And when you look at all the indicators that give you something about the business sentiment, investor sentiment, or something like that, they all seem to be positive and in fact growing, right? So for example, African currencies are actually stabilizing, and in fact, some of them are appreciating against the dollar. Now, part of that is just because globally the dollar has weakened against major currencies, and so that may be part of that reason. But in fact, it's a little bit more than that, because what we see is that the indices, for example, the Morgan Stanley composite index that shows you something about the frontier markets or something like that, has grown about 28% in Africa last year. Right? So that's an indication that there's a little bit more appetite for risk-taking among investors. And African frontier markets are considered some of the riskiest. So the fact that it's growing at 28% during an election year in 2025 is an indication that in fact there's something going on. Secondly, the financial markets that have frozen completely for African countries have actually begun to open up. Right? So now, a lot of countries are going back to the Eurobond market and borrowing at relatively, still relatively high, premiums, but surprisingly, after the high premiums of 2020 to 2023, by 2024 and last year, the premiums have come down substantially and are now almost at par with what you see in Latin America, right? Or even, And then finally, what we see is that these economies continue to grow, right? Even some of the ones that, so Cote d'Ivoire, for example, is one of the fastest growing economies. For the first time, we are projecting using our global economic prospects was released just a week ago. And what we show there is that for the first time, Sub-Saharan African countries are going to be growing at a rate equal to Southeast Asia, right? About 4.3%, and next year about 4.5%. And some of the fastest growing countries are the ones that have just had elections that you mentioned. Tanzania will be about 6%, Cote d'Ivoire is around 6%, and so on and so on, right? So that all tells you that in fact, I think investors and people who have now come to understand the continent realize that, it's not one country. There are a lot of specificities about these countries. They're weighing in the fundamentals of these countries. They're not, investors are not looking only at elections. Elections bring volatility, but what they're really looking at, fundamentals of issues. Are the macroeconomy correct? Is inflation low? Are these countries managing their debt properly? Are they going to be able to have foreign exchange to import, the inputs they may need? Are taxes going to be, the levels of taxes and reliability, the predictability. Those are the kinds of things they're looking at. The thing that surprised me the most is how the incumbents in these countries, in an attempt to try and win elections and reduce competitive space, really bring in a lot more risk than is necessary, right? They bring in, they raise tensions, they lead to social unrest or even conflicts, and it's completely unnecessary, right? So this is what surprised me the most, but the rest of it didn't surprise us.
No, I think that's an excellent point that you make, and what you're seeing is sort of being borne out and should give greater confidence to investors, especially the point about the rate of growth across the continent of some African countries and compared to Southeast Asia. So it goes back to the point that you made, Brian, about sort of Africa being really this new frontier. There's increased interest and also engagement for those who are perhaps willing to bear some of the risk, but to understand that some of that risk is not necessarily borne out by the data or even by the dynamics of a political shift and transitions. And those who are there for the long term want to be there for the long term and for those investments. And even for those who want to enter the market, that risk mitigation and that comfort level should be assuaged somewhat by some of the numbers that and the data that you've just recently conveyed here and in the report that was recently released. Flory, I'd like to turn back to you for a moment to dig in a little bit deeper into what you're hearing in terms of engaging and companies and your members engaging on the continent around these electoral cycles. The Corporate Council in Africa obviously represents companies with significant long-term commitments to African markets. Are you seeing differences in how companies approach policy dialogue and stakeholder engagement during transition periods versus more stable political environments? And what practices have proven most effective in maintaining business continuity through these transitions?
So thank you, Dana. It's a good question. So I think one of the things we have to give the companies credit for is, especially when they're on the ground and they have great teams there with local folks who are parts of those teams, is that they have a good sense of who actually is going to win. It doesn't really come as a total surprise to them. Though, in a few cases like Botswana, I think people may have been surprised with what happened. But because they are anticipating who the leaders will be, the same ones or maybe from the same party, they already have a bit of a handle on things. I think they also are good at looking at post-election scenarios where, if this group wins, if this president wins or person wins, we're likely to see these kinds of policies. If this person wins, we're likely to see these kinds of policies. And I think in advance of those elections, in terms of engagement, they may not want to be out there aligning with one particular candidate or another. I think they are very astute in avoiding that and actually trying to be in public engagements where no one can say afterwards that they had aligned themselves with this particular candidate and party or that particular candidate and party. They're pretty savvy at knowing not to do that. I think that for them, they're mostly looking at what we hear are the fears and concerns about whether their contracts will be honored, whether they'll be forced to renegotiate contracts with a new administration. The old we weren't there then, we're the new folks, and so now you have to come back to the table. And I think they're ready to use the local laws and procedures, the local environment. They know how to handle this kind of thing. But of course, it can be difficult, and sometimes they need partners from the U.S. Embassy, embassies, associations, et cetera, to kind of help make the case not to do that. And the last thing I'd say is a lot of the newly elected heads of state come in, and they really need to provide tangible benefits to their people. They're under pressure to show that you've elected me, and now there's actually going to be benefit to you. And I think that in some ways, the companies can take advantage and leverage that, because they can say, well, okay, we want to move forward with an investment. We need you to sign this particular document or agreement. And so they can leverage that, because then the country and the head of state, the new head of state, can say, we have now been able to get some new investment, or we were able to get this company here to do something differently that will, impact our people positively. So they take advantage of that need to actually prove something beneficial to the people in those countries who elected those new leaders.
Thank you. I think those are excellent points. And if you will allow me just for a moment, I want to make sure that I'm not being a bad former diplomat in not recognizing specifically our ambassadors who are in the room. I should have said all protocols observed, and that would have absolved me. But I will specifically like to thank the ambassadors of Benin, Mauritania, Angola, and Cote d'Ivoire, and Sierra Leone. Thank you for your presence today, and please forgive me for not specifically mentioning you in the beginning. We are very, very honored to have you here today, as well as the former U.S. ambassador to Cote d'Ivoire. Thank you so much for being here. So turning back to political transitions, Brian, I'd like to turn to you, giving your experience navigating political transitions and understanding how policy priorities shift with new administrations. What advice would you give to business leaders trying to anticipate regulatory or policy changes in post-election environments? And how can companies position themselves to be heard by new governments while managing the risk that promised reforms may not materialize?
Yeah, listen, I think the thing that you see more, at least that I'm noticing with clients who are wanting to invest in Africa, is they're engaging a lot sooner. And as you said, there's more depth to that engagement. Mm-hmm. You see that happen here, where companies sort of reach out well before elections. They have a long-term plan. I'm now seeing that more in these companies who are looking to invest in Africa. They're now talking to political parties. They're talking to oppositions. They're talking to more groups before the election and trying to frame what their message needs to be of what success looks like for them, or for the company, which would also mean success for these political parties. That's something that's different, that's new, and I encourage that. And I think we've seen, at least through Mercury and some of our clients, we've seen them have successes in establishing the relationship before the elections, establishing priorities before the elections, and then having those needs and addressed, discussed during a transition, and then ultimately seeing the public policy. It's no longer wait till somebody's in office. I think what we're noticing now is companies are willing to engage everybody, and ultimately when the right horse wins, go in and say, hey, we've been here early, we've had these talks. I think that's a good thing. It obviously shows that Africa is a hot spot. It shows what you said more than anything else, is that the judicial system gets more rooted. You get more confidence in investors, and for investors to come in early rather than just coming in at the last minute with money and hoping that's enough, I think that structurally sets up Africa in a very strong position.
Thank you. I absolutely agree with that. Kendra, I'd like to turn back to you for a moment, and from your perspective on trade and investment policy, how do African electoral cycles actually influence U.S. commercial engagement on the continent? Are there specific policy areas? I mean, obviously we talk about the regulatory environment and, viability of contracts and such in these transitions, but are there other specific policy areas such as the future of AGOA reauthorization? We know that is actively being debated on the Hill, or other bilateral investment agreements or regulatory harmonization where electoral transitions create windows of opportunity or heightened uncertainty for American businesses?
No, it's a great question, Dana. And I think, I'm an optimist, but I firmly believe that everything is an opportunity. And so I certainly see it in that way. And I think the companies that we're privileged to work with see it that way too. Transitions, present opportunities to make your case for the work that you're doing and how it aligns with a particular, North Star for, a government, whoever it may be. I want to agree with something that Brian just said, which is that companies are thinking about this long before an election actually ever happens. Long before we're in an inauguration space, companies have thought about that. Just like they've thought through, being in a market. They're there for the long term. So they're already thinking about and engaging stakeholders and having an understanding of what some of those policy priorities may be for a government, and understanding how the work that they're doing helps those governments achieve those aims. And to a person, right now, I think as we talk about elections, one of the issues that's permeated is the question of Gen Z and the youth demographic across the continent. And a top consideration is, how do we ensure that these young people have pathways to gainful employment, to self-actualization, to the economic futures that they want? And so what better way, if you are a US company investing in a market, than to be able to show how your investments are helping to enhance job creation, enhance growth. And it's a similar story here in the United States, not only the role that they play as US companies in the United States delivering value at home, but how their engagement abroad helps make that stronger. And so it's a lens through which companies can highlight the opportunities they bring on the continent. It's a lens through which they can highlight to the US government, who they work with closely to have more robust engagement on the continent, that these are opportunities for the US government to support their aspirations and their efforts in these markets. And it's an opportunity too to bring perspective and realism to the policymaking process, so that when issues like AGOA's reauthorization come forward, companies can speak with authority about what their investments are in a market, what they're doing, what they're delivering in whichever African country or countries they're operating in, but how that delivers at home and how that should then shape our US commercial engagement from an official standpoint to hopefully align and match and provide tools for what US companies need when they're on the continent. So I think all of it is an opportunity, and I think we do well to think of it in that way, that there are more ways that we can show, and I'm speaking broadly on behalf of business, but that business can show the value of what it delivers, in communities, in countries where they operate, in partnership with other companies, but also with governments, to really turn the tide and create economic growth for all.
That's an excellent point when you talk about the opportunities and making sure the youth demographic across the continent is really integrated into this economy. We talk all the time about the age of the continent and this youth demographic that really is driving a lot of the innovation forward on the continent. But what are these new administrations in these countries providing to them in order to help advance economic growth, which spreads prosperity for all? At least it should, right? So, I like to turn back to Andrew, and then we talking about, trends and growth. Yes, you're my econ guy, so I got to turn back to you. From your vantage point, and as you analyze macroeconomic trends across the continent, how do electoral cycles typically impact fiscal policy and economic reform trajectories in African economies? Are you seeing evidence that the 2025 elections have accelerated or decelerated some critical reforms, whether it's in debt management, subsidy rationalization, structural transformation, or what does this potentially portend for growth prospects in these markets?
So what we usually see is a before and after. So before elections, just before elections, you see a deterioration in the fiscal position of these countries, right? There's subsidies galore. There are lots of wage increases that are promised. There's a lot of spending on targeted regions or voters and so on, right? So what happens then is fiscal positions deteriorate. Eventually that has kind of like a rollover effect where it affects debt. Eventually it might lead to inflation spikes and so on, right? And so deterioration generally in the macroeconomy. And then what happens is that big reforms that are very difficult, that are very unpopular, often don't get done. Or in some cases, unpopular reforms get reversed, right? And you see this across multiple countries, right? We always track, for example, like this electoral spending spikes just before elections. And then they spend a lot of time the next few years trying to mop that up and try to clean up, right? It's crazy stuff.
Sort of counterproductive.
But then you switch immediately after is when bold reforms get done, right? Just think about Nigeria, for example, right? Took decades to try and do these subsidy reforms that was consuming close to, 3-4 percentage point of their GDP. And they had that window of opportunity to try and reform it, and boom, it was done. Same thing with Kenyan, elections in 2022 when, Ruto came to power, he basically got rid of all the consumption subsidies. He went ahead and subsidized farmers in order to increase food supply and something like that, but he got rid of consumption subsidies. So this difficult, Malawi recently, they had elections recently, they have started increasing fuel prices now that, which was subsidized heavily and was leading to all kinds of, exchange rate crisis. So, so immediately after elections, big reforms get done, plus you will see a lot of investments, public investments usually, immediately after these reforms because they have a mandate to deliver, right? They have, elections, that's the good thing about elections, right? You have to basically try to be held accountable. You go and you make promises to electorate. You have to deliver on those electorates. So we see usually particular kinds of sectors get, enormous investments, whether that is education promises that are made or health or infrastructure and so on and so on, right? And so you begin to see that uptake. But the challenge that African countries are facing, just like Kendra was saying, is there is a lot of talk these days throughout the electoral cycles or even just in between electoral cycles, is a lot of the language around structural transformation. A lot of language around that. A lot of countries, and that is the reason is because they have a huge jobs challenge. The working age population in Africa will double by 2050.
Wow.
Right? There will be a 620 million additional working age population by 2050. This requires huge investments in infrastructure, such as energy, roads, transport systems, railways, you name them. It requires opening up a lot of the economy, improving the business environment so that the businesses can invest. And it also requires having a lot of private sector coming because the fiscal positions of these countries right now is not that great. Public investments are going to be constrained because of these high levels of debt. And so what will be the most attractive thing is PPPs, private sector investments taking up a lot of these, gaps that the public sector can't fill now. So what we do in the World Bank is to try and help them, first of all, create this business environment with our Be Ready, instrument. We have an instrument called Be Ready, where we assess, a country's business environment in general. And create these league tables so that they can basically try to do the reforms, have positive action by the government. But we also try and help them with investments. We have this energy push called the Mission 300, where we're trying to get 300 million Africans connected to energy, and the whole, skill formation and so on and so on. But in general, that's the language now that is characterizing a lot of the election cycles, language of transformation, job creation for young people. And it's going to be interesting to see because, you see that in Cote d'Ivoire, you see that in Kenya, you see that in Zambia. We'll see how they learn from each other, basically.
Absolutely. Excellent point. And good to know about that tool that you have that's available to investors and to anyone really, I think, who is interested in looking at the continent as a viable destination, emerging market destination base. Before we open it up to questions, I do have one last question for you, Ambassador Fitzgerald. I get the sense some of you are chomping at the bit to ask questions, but I have one more. So as someone who is working at the intersection of business strategy and African markets, how do you counsel clients on distinguishing between electoral noise and substantive signals that should trigger strategic adjustments? When you're conducting due diligence, for example, or advising on market entry timing, what political risk indicators prove most reliable in predicting post-electoral business environments?
All right. I think there's a general saying out there, businesses want stability. Right. And that's true to an extent, but let's not confuse stability with rigidity. There are plenty of places that have elections, continual elections, but the same president for 40 years. I'm not sure I would call that stable. I would call that rigid. And a concrete house is rigid, but when you have a tremor and it collapses, it's spectacular. And so businesses don't want that hanging over their heads. So when they're looking for stability, they're looking for something that has the ability to adapt and evolve. The economies of most African states have evolved dramatically over the last 5-10 years. The arguments of literally 2015, I don't see it as particularly relevant today. And companies are starting to see that. So when they look for a modern, flexible version of stability, they're looking for transparency. They're looking to see the difference between policy and populism. And so when you're looking at what does it mean for a company, is the government looking at, are they talking about expanding the power grid through PPPs, like our colleague just said? Or are they just saying more power for people, which could end up being a financial disaster? What are we looking at? And so that degree of specificity is a huge part of what makes stability matter. Now, there's a flip side to that. We also just heard about Nigeria and the fuel subsidies. One can be pretty certain, and anyone who observed it knows it, the Nigerians did not campaign on a policy of removing fuel subsidies and raising prices for the voters. But when they looked at installing a policy that was going to be better, medium and long term for the Nigerian state, they knew that was something that they would have to do. It'd been dragging on for decades. And it's a similar story in many, many countries across the world. This is not just an African thing. And so taking advantage of those opportunities to install policies that matter. If there's a degree of specificity in the policy, it's something you can judge pro or con. If there's no specificity, run. And I think that's the key factor for companies. Those are the indicators we're looking for. What really matters? What is this government going to do? And that can flex based on the kind of government, the opportunities they have. But we're seeing these changes that are just dramatic. we just had the mention of the Gen Z protests, and I was thrilled that she mentioned that because if she didn't, I was going to. But you talked about the difference between noise and substance. A lot of political demonstration is, in fact, noise. I mean, that's its intention. Gen Z protests didn't have anything really to do with specific politics, but Africa has a generation of digital natives. And there's lots of arguments all the time about all the lacking infrastructure, especially in the digital space in Africa. But in fact, Africa does have a vibrant digital space. We have digital natives who see that traditionally they aren't getting to share in what appears to be political or economic growth in their countries. And they're demanding it. And the governments that are taking that seriously are the interesting ones. Even if we've seen it on occasion where they will try to renegotiate a long-term contract with a business. But when you realize why, the company may be a little bit frustrated, and I'm obviously thinking of a specific example, but the company realizes this is not a bad thing to have a government that cares about its political viability, that cares about what's happening to its people, and if we have to readjust here, that's part of that flexibility that matters.
Right. That's a good thing, right?
Yeah, smart companies are flexible.
Your advice is, though, if there's no substance, run.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, I like that. I'd like to open it up now. We have about 5 to 7 minutes for questions. So I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions. Please feel free, raise your hand, and we'll have Sarah bring you the microphone. Questions, comments, or statements? Or I'm just going to go and continue to ask my questions. Oh, here we go. This gentleman right here, Sarah, second row here on the end. If you could introduce yourself, wait for the microphone and then introduce yourself, and you can ask your question. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Darnley Howard. I'm president of Advanza International here in Washington. And my question has to do with the extent to which American companies are partnering with the African private sector, particularly with African investors. I work with a lot of what I would call more financial investors, more sort of private equity types and venture capital types, and both based here and based in Africa. And I'm wondering to the extent that they're seeking to partner with similar African companies to help to get a better feel for what the lay of the land is and to make better deals and to understand risk better.
Is there one specific panel member that you wanted to pose that to, or we can open it up?
Sure, maybe to Flory, but
Maybe
I'm not
to
sure.
But I also saw Ambassador Fitzgerald, so we can, Flory and Troy can tag team on this one. Thank you.
Well, that's a great question, and I think most of the U.S. companies are doing several things. They are looking to local partners, folks on the ground, but specifically local, so that people who know the political environment, people who understand the ecosystem in those countries, they are looking to invest with them. And I think that's a little different than in the past where, American companies often might go in and sort of think, I'll do it on my own. The other way that they're engaging with the local business community is through their supply chains, where they are sourcing from local suppliers of products that they need. And that's where the smaller businesses and the youth-oriented or youth-run businesses come in, women-owned businesses. And I think that that's a place where U.S. companies do well in terms of their engagement with others. I think when we hear from some of the governments, some of their other partners don't necessarily have businesses that engage as well with the local community, hire local community, train local community, transfer skills to local partners. And I think American businesses are seen as doing a good job in that area.
Thank you, Flory.
Yeah.
Troy, yes.
Two aspects on this. First, expats are expensive. American companies, and I hate the term Western companies because Korea and Japan are included here and they're not West, but also just the very successful companies that exist in Africa. The ones that are effective always look for localization. Expats are expensive. The entire way of doing business, from the American way of doing business, is to come in, to invest in your workforce, you pay your taxes. That is how the development moves forward. And then on the second part, I would say at the last year's Africa CEO Forum and also at the US-Africa Business Summit, the absolute rock stars of those events were the African capital markets. They're not just successful at investing in Africa. Now they've got billions of dollars investing around the rest of the world. We have African companies investing in Latin America, in the United States itself, and in Europe. The effect of what works makes a difference. We don't bring in laborers. We bring in only what is needed for the company that's coming. But you look for localization because that's what works long term. When people say that it's almost impossible to compete with the Chinese, it's not. Oh my God, it's actually easy to compete with the Chinese because our way of doing business works. You go to any American company on the continent, pretty much any country, you will find not just laborers from the local workforce, you'll find technicians, you'll find managers, you'll find CEOs. The board members will be local, because that's the long-term effective way of doing business. I'm hugely optimistic on that point. Localization works in Africa.
Kendra, I know you want to jump in too.
Just a quick two-finger, and thank you for the question, Darnley. I might not use the term localization, that has some implications in some places, but I do think that U.S. companies, by and large, are seeking partners locally who they can work with and who have an alignment and with whom they can scale. And I'd be remiss if I didn't note that we have a collection of leaders across the continent in our American Chambers of Commerce, which serve as sort of two-way business houses, if you will, where the local economies, business leaders who are looking to engage the United States are active, and U.S. companies who are looking to engage the market are active. And so we are constantly traveling and participating in AmCham business summits, bringing companies to meet their counterparts to be able to explore what's possible together. So I think not only do U.S. companies look very carefully to find local partners, but there is a network of AmChams that are helping to facilitate that on ground.
Great. Yes, Andrew, jump on in.
So three things, actually. First, a lot of the ways in which financing flows, companies financing, American companies finance African companies is through the stock market. That's one. Two, 80% of financing for African startups comes from outside. And that is usually a lot of American companies, but of course also European companies, especially when they come to fintech, when it comes to issues around solar energy investments and things like that. These are new technologies. Usually that's where it comes from. The third thing is that most foreign companies will go to a market where there is already an ecosystem of local companies, because the local companies have knowledge and information about that local market. And so you would see that, in fact, a lot of the foreign direct investments, especially from the US or from Europe or elsewhere, will go to places where there's already a very robust local private sector, not the other way around.
Thank you. I think we're almost at time. If there is one other burning question. Seeing none. Great. Well, I don't know if there were any last remarks that anyone wants to sort of chime in on. Brian, if you wanted to say anything, you were sort of like the only one who didn't pile on the last answer.
I would, bearing time, I would only say, the thing that for me that is exciting about Africa is a phrase that we've used in the finance sector for a long time, called creative financing. Now, with Trump, we almost can call it creative diplomacy. And you now have the ability with this president and this team to come forward and have conversations and sort of clean the slate or talk about the things that you've never been able to talk before. I don't know whether that's a good or a bad thing. At the end of the day, time will tell. But the creative diplomacy makes almost anything possible now. And I have countries who've come and had these conversations with the administration where they felt it was a long shot and they got a hook. And that's the difference between this administration and others. And time will tell whether it's a good or a bad thing, but I certainly, for the short term, I'm enjoying this creative diplomacy that President Trump's created.
Creative diplomacy. Like it. Okay, and we are at time, so I'd like to thank all of my panelists here today. You guys have been wonderful. This is, I think, it's really been a good conversation. You've given some, strategic advice, I think, for the investors who are interested, who not only are already on the continent, but who are also interested in investing on the continent, but also sort of helping to frame the political transitions framework that we've seen across the continent in 2025, and as we go into this year of continued elections, and how to think about that when they think about, investing and thinking about Africa as a viable emerging market with our strong economic data to back it up and tools even at our disposal. So I'd like to thank you all, and I'd like to thank you here in the audience and online for joining us today, and we hope to see you back for future conversations. Thank you and have a great rest of the day.